Hello, I'm Charna Davis Wiese. They say experience is the best teacher, and no one knows that better than today's guest, an expert in experiential learning. Dr. Sheri Dressler joins us. Thanks so much for coming here. I have so much to talk to you about that I hope we have enough time. One of the things you mentioned in the program is one of the things is an internship that a lot of people have. People can get an internship, co-op education, and what's the other thing?
Service learning.
Service learning. I think that when I look at my own life, the internships I have had probably helped me make decisions and get me to where I wanted to be more than anything else in all the other years of college and all the other degrees and this and that. Do people really understand? Because a lot of programs, they'll say you have to do the service work, you have to do the internship, and oh Lord, do they realize how important it is?
Most students don't realize until they have the opportunity. We usually get students who come in and they go through this process, and at the end they say, this is the best part of my education, I don't know what I would have done without it. But different majors support experiential learning differently. So there are some fields like education, nursing, perhaps engineering, in which it's so much part of the culture that the students expect to get experience, recognize that they need it, plan for it. And in fact, the industries tend to expect it as well. But there are many other majors where that's not the case. And so we have to sell it at the front end, and then at the end they become the best salesmen themselves.
Especially if it's not required. I don't remember, I don't think it was required for the journalism degree that I got, but I knew that we were all so afraid. We knew there were 100,000 people applying for every job or something ridiculous like that, that we all did it. And you know, the anecdotal stories that I hear from other people who actually went into the business, it was, like you say, the best thing I ever did, but it was not really encouraged. It wasn't necessary, and I think a lot of people might be missing out on something that's so important for them.
Well, I think what's happened over the last maybe 10 or 15 years is that there's been a big shift in higher education, so that the idea of applying what you're learning in the classroom is becoming increasingly essential. And there are a number of factors that have caused that to occur. Back in the late 90s, actually even in the early 90s, there were a lot of research efforts done by business and then by government to show that students weren't graduating with the skills and the attitudes that they needed. And so there was a turn away from teaching to learning. Rather than measuring how many classes are taught, there was an effort to measure what students actually learned. And that became an effort for everyone to try to rearrange how higher education was occurring to be able to measure what students were really learning. And experiential learning became a part of that. So now you'll find many, many more fields that will require it or provide it as an option. Part of the difficulty is it takes time to create these opportunities. And faculty don't necessarily have the time. It's kind of people who are philosophically oriented, or they've had an experience themselves and they know how important it is.
Right, and it really gives you an idea more than anything else of what that career is going to be like. Like when I was taking my internship in a very big station in a very big city in Miami, and there were all the things I've learned, and I learned the law of mass communications, and I learned how to write for television, and there I was the first night of the internship, and we talked about this before, and it was July 4th, and of course that's where you put your free help on July 4th when everybody's out. And my job was to go listen to a police scanner, so the producer wouldn't miss anything. And I was in Miami, and I'd come over there and I'd say, oh, there was a shooting so-and-so place. Oh, that happens all the time. And they'd send me back to the scanner, and there was a stabbing. This person might die, they're transporting them right now. And they'd say, oh, that happens all the time, just go back. And then finally, I was horrified to hear that a child was killed at a fireworks celebration, and shaking, I went to tell the producer, and they went, now that's a story. And my response was, how can you treat it like that? But it was a real insight into the world of news where you almost have to steel yourself against the emotions of it, or you can't do the job. And the reporter on scene probably can take it more to heart and more seriously than the producer can, because the producer has all logistics to do. It taught me more about television news probably that one night than I had in 3 years of college.
Well, and that happens so often because people have particular ideas about what a field is, often from TV now. One of my favorite examples is that I have a cousin who's an astronomer. And I always pictured him looking off into the stars, looking through this wonderful telescope, until I actually asked him, and he said, oh no, astronomers spend about 2 weeks a year looking through the telescopes. The rest of the time, they're physicists. They sit analyzing the data on the computers. So that was a real shock for me, but it reminded me that so often people only see a very small piece, the glamorous piece of a particular field, and they don't see the rest of it. And for students now who are oriented toward excitement and they see these exciting things in the media, it's really important for them to get an opportunity to see what real people do every day. I know for me, part of the reason I got into the field is because I was in a social work program in my master's program. And I read about schizophrenia and all these things, but it was only when I actually got into the field and saw a real-life schizophrenic and I said, oh, that's what flat affect looks like. And so I realized that for me, having the experience was the real vehicle for me to go back and want to read the books and want to learn that information. And it got me interested in the field in general.
And you said some of the students come to you and tell you, and then this actually helped them decide that, no, this is not what I want to do. This is not my passion.
Oh, sure. Another example is a young woman, very talented woman with a very high grade point average. She came in saying she had always wanted to be a lawyer. It was the only thing she ever wanted to do. And so we were excited. We put her in a very high-level law firm. She did an excellent job in her internship. And then when she came back, she said, I can't tell you, this is the most wonderful experience I've ever had. I never want to be a lawyer. And you've saved my parents a fortune, and I'm going to go into something else. So that's a success.
And that's true. It would be nice also, is there any kind of program when you're not sure what you want to do for you know, kind of like when my husband was doing grand rounds and you're becoming a doctor and you get to check out the specialties. You really don't have that for a kid, do you, ever?
Well, there are other efforts that higher education makes. For instance, in career services, whom we collaborate with, they have things like job shadowing, and even in high schools they have job shadowing. They have externships, which are short-term opportunities for people to go into a locale and at least get an overview of a field. But usually internships are the first means for students to do that. Now there are other options. For instance, we have a lot of service learning opportunities. And service learning is just a small piece of any course in which some of that course content is taught through a service project.
And that's teaching them to give back to the community as well.
Yes, but it can be in any field. So an example is we've had industrial engineers go and work in a clinic and help them to completely revamp the efficiencies of the clinic. We've had nurses doing community nursing. So it's not as much time as an internship, which is much more intensive, but again, it gives them a chance to go out for a short-term opportunity to get a sense of what's out there.
So what's co-op learning?
Co-op is actually the longest period of time.
It's the opposite of the service learning,
yes,
almost?
That's right, because students can start as early as their sophomore year, and they can either alternate full-time semesters, which some companies ask for, like NASA, or they can work part-time continuously all the way through till their senior year. So by the time they graduate, they've actually had their first job. And in most cases, we find in 85% of the cases, they get jobs related to their major before they even graduate. They're offered a position for when they graduate. And they basically are going into positions that are beyond entry-level positions because they've had so much experience.
And that helps you when it says in the application, what's your job experience? You just graduated, you actually have some.
Well, and not only that, often, again, people have a very narrow idea of what's required, but there are lots of skills, attitudes, orientations, things that you need that are not necessarily specific to that discipline. They're in many different disciplines. But people don't always know. A good example is an engineer who doesn't really know that they're going to have to write memos or they're going to have to make presentations. They're fine on the computer, they're great at math, but they've never really worked at gaining those kinds of skills because they never believed they would need them. But once they go out there, they realize that unless they can tell someone what they're really doing, they're not going to succeed, even with all those other discipline-related skills.
You know, that happened in the TV station a lot, where interns would come in and they wanted to be an anchor. They didn't realize, or a reporter, they didn't realize that primarily we're writers. The number one thing we do is go out, research, especially when I did documentaries, we were researchers and writers. The little tip of the iceberg is the on-camera part. They were very disappointed because they have to write. Yeah, somebody's got to write this stuff. And it was a shock to so many of them. I would say probably 9 out of 10 didn't want to do it. But when they were in the station, they may went to the graphic arts department or saw something else that they liked as well. It opens their eyes to all the different things in their field.
Well, exactly. You know, there's a giant book of titles for jobs. It's tremendous. Of course, now it would be online. But if you ask someone to list the kinds of jobs that exist, they would come up with 10 or 20. There are so many other opportunities out there that no one could ever really know about unless they either knew someone in the field or they had an opportunity to explore. And so often that is the case. Someone goes in and in the course of trying to do one thing uncovers something else. Also, it gives them a chance to talk to people. When they're out there, they can network, they can ask people, how did you get into this? What kinds of things should I be looking at? What should I study? What's the most challenging thing? What do you love the most? What do you love the least? These kinds of things that would really allow them to take better advantage of their education so that when they get out, they really know why they did it and what they're going toward. There's really a lot of concern now that students drop out of school early. And part of the reason that they drop out is because they don't know why they're there. They don't really have a sense, a picture of themselves doing something for which a degree would be needed. So if you know where you want to go and you have a sense that you could really succeed there, it makes it much easier to make the sacrifices, put in the extra effort, take the class you didn't really want to take, whatever it is, to get there because you know what your goal is.
Well, we're going to ask you how you got to your goal from where you started when we come back. We'll be right back.
So in 1975, the United States ranked 3rd in the world in percentage. Must be the new guy. Guess you can say I was with you guys the whole time. New guy.
UCF and the Central Florida Research Park have helped create 41,000 jobs and contributed about $3.3 billion to the regional economy.
3, and that's only new girl.
So if it seems like your company's growing, it probably is. UCF stands for opportunity.
We're back. We're talking with Dr. Sheri Dressler, and we're talking about experiential learning, going out into the real world to help you reach your goals. And we're going to find out how you got into the real world to reach your goals. And it was probably, I like to ask people all the time to help other people follow their own path and chart their own course, so to speak. Did little Sheri Dressler say, I'm going to be an experiential learning specialist when you were a little girl? This probably was not your goal.
Absolutely not. There are no specific degrees either to do experiential learning. It's a good example of a wonderful field that no one would know about unless they interacted with it in some other way. No, actually, what I did know was that I wanted to do something that I felt was a contribution. I grew up in a family where people were focused on contributing to society.
How lucky.
Oh, yeah.
You were.
I was grateful. And also a family that traveled, was very oriented toward connecting to the rest of the world. And that's really reflected in all of the things that I do.
So that's really amazing, because knowing what I do about you now, you really continued that.
Yes.
In your own adult life. So you had travels as a child. Was it something you did as a family extra? Did your parents travel or as part of their work?
My father traveled as part of his work, and he also invented things and dealt with a lot of professionals all over the world. So I would hear stories and people would come to the house, and it was very exciting. But I think what it did do, I'm very grateful for this, it helped me not to be afraid of things that were new and different. When we would go to a restaurant when we were very little, my father would always insist that we had to order something new. We couldn't just get chow mein every time. We had to try something new. And if we didn't like it, we could order something else, but we had to be willing to be open. And that's allowed me really to go to many different countries and really get to appreciate diversity in a way I probably wouldn't have if I hadn't had that experience.
So you first went into counseling and social work?
Yes. When I graduated with a bachelor's degree, I had become a member of the Baha'i Faith, which is very world-embracing. And I wanted to get a master's degree in something with which I could make a contribution. And so I decided to leave the country because I wanted to find out what was needed in other places. So I traveled through Europe and a little bit of Africa, and I decided at that time that I wanted to go into social work. So I came back. I did, in fact, get a master's in social work, but I also wanted to get a degree in public health. But at the time, I got married. And so I wasn't able to do that. But instead, I ended up working in social work for a little while and decided to move into education.
Was this while you were in England? Or?
Actually, no, this was in Massachusetts,
okay,
where I grew up. My family had since moved to Florida while I was gone, but I did go to school in Massachusetts, in Boston. And then I moved down to Florida. And that move to education was really very helpful. And this was through someone who knew me and had a feeling that I probably would be much happier in education than in social work in the long run. And he was absolutely right. This is where mentors come in. And so I did that. And that led me to experiential learning because I was doing a program where I was putting students in human resources out in the community doing work. And halfway through, this was in a community college, I ended up running their cooperative education program too. At that point, I decided to get an education to go on and get a PhD. And there weren't any public health programs around, but there was a counselor ed program. So that's where I moved to UCF and started working on coursework to get a degree in counselor ed and counseling. And I liked that orientation because it was about mental health, not about mental illness. So that's allowed me not only to get through a bureaucratic system in a university, but it's also allowed me to do work overseas, not only in experiential learning, but also in counseling.
So then you started traveling for that. And how did that become such an integral part of your life? It really became almost a goal of it in itself. You know what I'm saying? So how'd that happen? Where's the first place you went?
Well, once I finished my degrees, I left the country. I took a professional development leave, and I took a year off and went to 14 different countries.
In a year?
In a year.
Wow.
And I went to places where things were changing. I went to South Africa, I went to Eastern Europe, I went all over the Pacific Rim, again, looking to see what was needed. And what I found was many of the education systems in these places were trying to develop experiential learning. And also, I found that they were in great need of social services and didn't have them. Now, I was a member of, and still am a member of, something called the World Association for Cooperative Education. So I had names of people in all of these different countries that I could go and visit and find out what they were doing in experiential learning. And at the same time, I contacted the Baha'is in all of these countries, and I set up whatever things I could do to help them. So everywhere I went, I was doing experiential learning, and I was also doing things to help people in mental health. So for that whole year, I did that. And then once I came back, I found that the place I could contribute the most, I thought, was in China, where I had spent 4 months of that year. So since then, I've gone to China every year since to try to help them develop curriculum for mental health programs and do kind of marathon classes because they have such a need. And also, they have a tremendous experiential learning system, and I've worked with them to expand that all over China.
And China has such a juxtaposition of what's going on, their culture versus their future, their past. You said that there was a big gap in the time when they didn't have mental health care and they didn't have all of this, and now they're trying to catch up. And that must be a lot to deal with as well, in a way good and in a way bad.
Well, when I went 15 years ago, they weren't even talking about mental health. I went for experiential learning, and I was meeting presidents of state industry, and I was meeting professors and presidents of universities. And while I was doing that, I mentioned to them that I could talk to the counselors. At that time, the counselors were in the moral education department. And they thought, strange American, but they had me talk to the counselors, and they realized that the counselors needed information because they had stopped studying psychology in 1950 and brought it back in 1990, and they had missed a tremendous amount of information.
Can you imagine 40 years of information to miss it? I just can't even imagine.
Right. Now, of course, the other side is then they didn't have to go through all the mistakes we made, but still...
Here's the good stuff.
That's right. So then everywhere I went, they had me connect to the experiential learning people, but they also had me talk to the counselors. So then halfway through that, I said, you know, I could also talk to the students. 500 students appear.
Oh, my goodness
This is how it
gracious.
works in China. They say be, and it is. So then I started talking to students about their issues, and I realized that the new, younger generation is much more open than the generation in the past because they have more contact with people all over the world, because there's a possibility to be a little bit more trusting. So all of these things combine to make it possible for not only a need for these things, because the market economy is creating some of the problems, but also students who want to study, where before they might not have. Before they couldn't choose what they studied.
Right.
In this country, we're not used to that. But there, if you ask someone, what do you want, they would look at you as if you were asking a question that had no meaning, because no one asked them that question. Someone chose who they married, somebody chose what they studied, somebody chose where they worked, and there was no issue about what is best for you. They would take tests, and whatever came out closest would be what they would do. But now they can actually pay to study what they want. And so now there's a big push for graduate education where people can actually pay and study something other than what the testing places them in. Now, of course, it's a tremendous country, the fifth of the world's people, and only a small number of people have an opportunity to go to university. So when I go, I'm dealing with the brightest of the bright, and they're so sensitive and so concerned about their country and the people in their country that it's a gift for me to be able to work with them. And of course, I'm bringing European thinking. And one time, I was talking to some other people who were working on that from Germany. They were there trying to train some people. And I said, do you ever worry that you're bringing this European thinking? And they said, are you kidding? The minute we finished, they start talking to each other and they rearrange it in a Chinese way, and it's not a problem. And they do, and it's wonderful. I'm hopeful that there'll be more and more people in that country who will do this kind of work so that they can contribute to what we know about human development.
I can't even imagine having that whole culture shift from one extreme to the other. You know, as you say, everything was chosen, and now they get to choose. That's enormous. It's a lot of stress, and with that probably comes a lot of wrestling with yourself on how to do this. Why am I doing the right thing, you know? So I'm sure you see problems that didn't exist a few years ago. There.
Oh, there's no question. Now they have tremendous issues of anxiety. What students don't know what they're going to do, how they're going to get a job necessarily. There's still state jobs, but there are a lot more choices. There's more depression, more addiction, just like our society. So they're inheriting all of those things that they were perhaps protected from before, but they're also gaining the freedom to choose. So the result is that they need help, but they also need encouragement, because historically they've been the businessmen of Asia, and you give them this much room and they run out and they create businesses and they get excited and they just move forward a mile a minute. So it's really marvelous to see that. I think in this country we don't get to see that very much. We get to see Chinese students in higher ed, but mostly we see what's in the news about China. It's very political. But there are people trying to live their lives, trying to find a way to help their children and help themselves. And they are having all the problems that we have. That's not actually just in China, all over the world. But the other side is that they're moving forward, and that's very exciting.
I imagine culturally, too, because it is an ancient culture with a lot of roots to the past, to have such a significant change in the whole mind thought of the culture, and just a generation ago, all the things that they're doing, they're feeling, they're thinking that are open to them were forbidden. And not only just frowned upon, but forbidden. That must be very hard to deal with, you know, very hard to come to terms in your mind with dealing with my past, which the heritage is so important there, and dealing with this future that's open to me.
Well, in fact, one of the images I have is a picture that I used to see this all the time, of this young kid on a bike with a t-shirt and, you know, looking relatively modern, with a grandmother on the back of his bike with the Nehru collar. And
she's wearing the old clothes.
Yeah, the generations are right there. You can see the difference right there, just over a short period of time. But they really want to move into the next century, so that's exciting. And of course, for me, being able to go at a time 15 years ago when they didn't share anything, and now 15 years later when that's possible, it's an exciting time to be able to contribute the kinds of things that I've been able to learn.
And even though you're not part of the culture, you experienced it then and now, and I'm sure that helps you so much. Dr. Sheri Dressler, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we've learned a lot. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. I'm Charna Davis Wiese. Join us again next time on UCF Profiles.